Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ASATA Live webinar. My name is Natalia, and I'll be moderating this webinar on data protection with ASATA's legal counsel and founding director of innovation consulting, Elizabeth de Stadler. Elizabeth specializes in information governance, data protection, consumer protection, and her favorite, plain language contracts and trading development. For those of you who haven't seen, we have 2 additional webinars coming your way in the coming months. I'll speak about that more in a little while. You'll have an opportunity to ask Elizabeth questions throughout this actual webinar, and it's really, really easy. All you need to do is go to the bottom of your screen, click on the Q&A folder, and type in your question. If the questions become pressing during the webinar, we will pose those questions. Otherwise, we'll pose those questions at the end of Elizabeth's presentation and see what we can answer for you. For those of you who've never used this webinar system, click on the Q&A button at the bottom, type your question, it will come straight through to me, and I'll pose those questions to Elizabeth once we're done. So with that in mind, let's hand over to Elizabeth and she'll take you through her presentation.
Thank you, Natalia. Good morning, everybody. Hi, so today we are tackling the very ambitious topic, data breaches, hope for the best, plan for the worst, and how to prepare for the Protection of Personal Information Act, or POPIA as it is known, and the GDPR, which is the European counterpart to that piece of legislation. Right, so how wrong can it really go? I have selected just a couple of data breaches. Some of them are fairly recent. That have affected the travel industry or the travel supply chain over the last couple of months. Most notably, in the last 2 weeks, we got a notification that British Airways is going to face a fine of in the order of £183 million. Similarly, Marriott, in the same week, got a notification that they'd be fined just under £100 million for 2 fairly significant data breaches. There also have been in the past breaches on a travel agency level, and I think that there are probably about 100 research studies that shows that this kind of cybersecurity risk or data privacy risk has now become one of the most significant risks that have to be managed by businesses in all sectors and everywhere on the supply chain. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to address these risks, I want to just give you an update on the status of POPIA and the GDPR, and I will also explain why it is relevant in this seminar to talk about a European piece of legislation. Firstly, so POPI was signed into law in 2013 already. All that means is that the legislation is final. It is extremely unlikely that it will change at all. And in December of this year, the information regulator also published their final regulations that give us a little bit more detail about what is required of businesses. Having said that, the president is still required to announce an effective date. And once that date is announced, all businesses will have at least 12 months to become compliant. In other words, if let's say for argument's sake, the president were to say that this Friday is the POPI effective date, all businesses will have until 1 year later to become compliant. So there is a sort of a moratorium period within which the regulator won't take action if something goes wrong. POPI's been a long time coming, and there has been quite a lot of activity, particularly recently. So the image that you see here is roughly a timeline. So in November 2013, it gets enacted. And in 2016, the information regulator has been appointed. And ever since then, they have been preparing or getting ready for the president to pull the trigger on this piece of legislation. That's not to say that they have done nothing. They have consistently responded to some of the major data breaches that we've had in South Africa over the last 18 months. They have also hired all of their senior staff, such as the CEO, CFO, and their head of IT policy, who is starting on the 1st of August. At this point, I have to always say, usually when people ask me, so when do I expect this act to be in full effect? I say, well, probably in about 20 to 24 months. But in the interest of making a full disclosure there, I have been saying that for about 6 years. So the answer to the question, when do we have to be compliant with POPIA, that answer at this point is just speculative. But we will talk about reasons why it is better to comply proactively rather than waiting for the act to become effective. One of those reasons is many of you are currently subject to POPI's counterpart in Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation. One thing to understand about the General Data Protection Regulation is that it has way more teeth than POPI. So those very big fines that I was referring to earlier are fines under the GDPR. Under that piece of legislation, European regulators are allowed to fine companies as much as 4% of their global turnover or 20 million euro, whichever one is the biggest. Right. So when do you have to be worried about the GDPR? The GDPR in the South African travel industry is largely or mostly applicable to those travel agents that focus on inbound travel. So the GDPR will apply to a South African travel agent if they market their services to individuals who are physically situated in the EU. So in other words, the best recent example, this is an actual example that I had of this in this industry, was actually a tour operator. They are situated in Cape Town, a South African incorporated company. They specialize in selling trips on these various cruise boats that we have in South Africa, and it appears certainly from their website that their target audience are Dutch people. And how I know that is that their communications are all also available in Dutch, and you can pay in euros, etc. It's quite transparent that they are targeting individuals while they are in Europe. Of course, in the interest of getting through quite a bit of information in 45 minutes, I am oversimplifying slightly. The image that you see right now are the 4 sort of different triggers. Most travel agents in South Africa who do fall under the GDPR do so as a result of the answer to question C. So does the organization offer goods or services to individuals in Europe? But of course, some of you might belong to groups of companies that actually are established in the EU in some way, and then the GDPR gets triggered. The good news is if you are GDPR compliant, you are probably about 80% on your way to become POPI compliant. Conversely, if you are POPI compliant, you are also around about 80% likely to be GDPR compliant. And we're going to talk about what compliance looks like in a moment. But what that means is, or what it illustrates, is that POPI was based on the GDPR's predecessor. So for a large part, the provisions of these 2 pieces of legislation are identical. Right, so why comply? And for the moment, I'm going to just refer to POPI, but know in the back of your minds that this goes for the GDPR as well. Why should you comply with this kind of legislation? For those of you who have met me before, you will know that I will say from time to time outrageous things like, I don't care about legislation. It's not a good reason to do anything. And that is particularly true in the arena of privacy legislation. And the reason for that is you can go and look at the media, but this is a very nice infographic that illustrates this point. We're going up in time. The dots are all data breaches. The size of the dots represent the amount of records that were disclosed. And as we go up in time, in 2016, 2017, and 2018, you can see that the rate of these data breaches have increased enormously. So we've also not been spared in South Africa. Last year, we had a very high-profile financial services email hack. We've had a view fines hack where almost 1 million records were disclosed. The Facebook scandal, for which Facebook just got fined $5 billion by the FTC, exposed the records of 60,000 South Africans to, amongst other countries, Russia. We had the master deeds data breach, which is now about 2 years ago, which involved the ID numbers of 60 million South Africans. That's almost all of us had our ID numbers stolen about 18 months ago, and then a variety of smaller breaches. One of the things that is incredibly important to understand, so every year IBM does a study of the cost of a data breach to a company. And this year, the average, or the last year's data showed the average cost of a data breach was 36.9 million rand. And that is currently the kind of risk that South African businesses are facing. And it has nothing to do with whether POPI is in effect yet or not. And the reason for that is this cost is comprised of all kinds of costs other than fines by regulators. I want to illustrate this point by referring to a breach at a American retailer called Target, a very ill-advised name, I think. This breach took place about 4 years ago, and their point-of-sale system, so where you swipe your credit card, got hacked, and a whole bunch of identifiable credit card records ended up online. This breach ended up costing them about $292 million. I'm not making these figures up. This is from their actual financial statements. And so if you look at what that figure is comprised of, none of those figures have much to do with the fact that there is legislation. And in fact, in America, there is no privacy legislation on a federal level. Firstly, because the breach ended up in the media, the CIO and the CEO had to resign. They had to settle $153.9 million worth of class actions. Incidentally, under the current South African law, so pre-POPI, if you had a data breach of this nature and you were negligent, you would also be facing class actions. There were about 140 million odd in other costs. Most of those were, well, about $250,000 was for the FCC fine that they got, but the rest was the cost of the breach. So they had to fork out for credit monitoring for millions of their customers. They had to go through several regulatory and other audits. But also, very significantly, their sales fell by 34%. And unfortunately, it was the holiday season. So that made up quite a bit of the cost. And importantly, they had comprehensive insurance covering them against cybersecurity issues, and that only covered 90 million of the 292 million price tag. So what you will see here is, I've not gone through the exercise of calculating what percentage $250,000 is of $292 million, but it is a very low percentage that was comprised of a regulatory fine. Also, at this point, it's just important to note that not all incidents are data breaches. There are many ways to breach POPI and the GDPR. It covers a whole host of privacy issues and not just information security. And this is a quote from Target's chief data analyst at the time. He said, "Just wait, we'll be sending you coupons for things you want before you even know you want them." And he was being slightly prophetic, because one of the other things that Target got fined for once is that they sent an email attaching various coupons for nappies and other baby products to the father of a teenager, congratulating her on her pregnancy, but her father did not know that yet. And that was an example of a data breach that isn't an information security issue. They were just being, this is not a legal term, but they were being quite creepy, and they had an information quality issue in that they thought they were talking to her, but they were actually talking to her father. Quite an amusing example, unless you are the teenage daughter. Right, so what does POPI and the GDPR cover? So I've just said it's not just about information security, so I want to just take a quick journey through all of the rules that are prescribed by these two pieces of legislation. And as is normally the case with legislation, they're not a particularly riveting read, and it's quite difficult to make sense of the legislation. So what we do is we organize it using this picture, right? So we have here something that is called the information life cycle. This is the block in the middle. And all around it, so for the entire duration of this information life cycle, you are required to keep personal information confidential. You are required to protect the integrity of the information. The integrity of the information relates to, are we sure this information that we're seeing in front of us is correct? To use an example, when we investigate data breaches, one of the first questions that I ask the organization is, right, so the hacker got in, can you tell me whether they changed any of the information that they had access to? The most obvious example of why a hacker would change information is, let's say you are hacking bank accounts or hacking hacking a bank. The piece of personal information that you usually would like to change is the bank balance. So banks obviously take extensive measures to ensure that your bank balance, that piece of personal information about you, is protected from unauthorized alteration or unauthorized editing. And then lastly, you are required to protect the availability of the information. So that is something that in risk management terms is called business continuity management. So are you sure that if something were to happen, let's say the primary server that you use fails, so it either becomes damaged by water or it just crashes, or do you have redundancy? So is there a backup of the information that you use on a day-to-day basis to run your business? And this is incredibly important from just a business management point of view. If you were to lose access to the traveler details, on whether it's permanently or temporarily, that will cost you quite a lot of money to rectify. Then once we get through what is called the CIA triad, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, because that is the three components of information security, we get to the information life cycle. And POPI and the GDPR prescribe rules for when you plan to use personal information. So an example would be if you launch a new service or a new product, or you start using a new system. When you go through the planning phase, both of these pieces of legislation require that you do something that is called a data privacy impact assessment, a DPIA. And the reason why I'm telling you the terminology is if you want to know what one of those look like, you can find quite a lot of information just by using good old Google. There are rules for where you can collect information from and rules for when you create information. Typically, businesses create information when they keep track of a client's behavior. So, for instance, you will have a record of a person's traveling habits, and you might use that to, for instance, market particular travel products to that particular traveler. Or you might use that data to improve your service delivery by anticipating where they like to stay, what times of the day they like to fly, and those kinds of things. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are just certain rules that attach to that. So, for instance, one of the major misconceptions about, or in the context of POPI and the GDPR, is that if someone put their personal information online, so on the internet, for instance, that companies are allowed to use that information as they see fit. So one example would be if you were to go to my website, or even to any or many websites, in fact, you will find that people put their email addresses and their telephone numbers there. And there are many companies that make a living out of scraping the internet for these personal pieces of personal information and then sell that information onto other businesses in order to enrich their data. This is a very common practice in South Africa. If you are making use of that, you need to be aware that once POPI comes into effect, it will be impossible to collect the person's data from the internet and sell it to other companies without that person's permission. Data scraping companies like that have already started facing quite debilitating fines in Europe. And again, the provisions are actually very similar between POPI and the GDPR. In fact, on this score, POPI is a little bit stricter. The general rule for collection is less is more. So you are only allowed to have the personal information that you need in order to run your business. You're not allowed to just store personal information in case you need to use it. The biggest breach that South Africa has ever seen was that master deeds breach. That was an estate agent who decided for no particular good reason that they would create their own database of all South Africans. The only problem with that was, well, apart from the fact that they don't have a legal basis to have that information once POPI comes into effect, was that they stored that large database on an unprotected server. And so all of our ID numbers have been compromised and are currently being bought and sold on the dark web. The third phase of the information lifecycle is when you use information, right? So let's use the traveler scenario. I have signed up with a TMC, and now they use my information as a traveler to book travel for me and to provide various other services. The good news is when you use a person's personal information, as long as what you are doing is necessary for you to perform your duties in terms of your contract with that person, you are entitled to use the personal information for that purpose. The other common reason for why we use personal information is because there are various pieces of legislation that tells us what we must do with personal information and what personal information we must collect. The most common example there is, for instance, that we don't ask our employees what race they are just out of interest. We ask that because the Employment Equity Act requires us to ask it. And obviously there you are entirely within your rights to process that personal information. When neither the contract nor legislation covers what you are doing, then you're on slightly more shaky ground. So for instance, POPI prescribes if you're going to do direct marketing that you should get the person's express consent. If you are going to do something like sell their information to someone else, you may need their express consent. But generally speaking, you don't need a person's permission. On this note of consent, and Otto asked that I alert him when I'm about to speak about this issue. Some of you might have noticed that in the last couple of months, we have had to deal with an ASATA regulation called Regulation 830D, in which the issue of the sharing of passenger details between travel agents and airlines is being discussed. Otto, I don't know if you want to take over and just give some background to this, or do you want me to explain what the regulation currently says?
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'd suggest if you just sort of frame what it currently stipulates, and then
right.
I'll just do a few things which are
Perfect.
going to impact from an operational point of view.
So in an extremely small nutshell, what 830D requires is that you provide the passenger details to airlines so that they can contact passengers in the event of disruption of their services, so an unexpected delay or cancellation of a flight. And we have been in extended conversations with IATA, and we're also not the only country where travel agent industry bodies have protested this particular regulation. And basically, if I had to sum up our position, is that sure, travel agents should notify their clients or the passengers that their details can be provided to the airline for purposes of service disruption communication, but that as a rule, travel agents have to be quite careful about who they share passenger details with. And so it is safer if you as travel agents take steps to leave that decision in the hands of the passenger, whether they want you to pass on their details to the airline. Speaking for the moment only for myself, I am a client of a TMC, and I very much prefer that my TMC don't share my cell phone number with airlines because, for instance, I don't like getting marketing emails. After that point, I think you can take over.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think to Elizabeth's point, guys, I think there is an express need for you to ensure that you have permission to share your passengers' data. We may look at how you want to manage that operation within your business in several different ways. We are very cognizant of the fact that some of you may already contractually, as part of your agreements with your corporate customers or even your leisure customers, have an arrangement whereby they clearly stipulate that they do not wish to have their private contact details shared with third parties. You are within your rights then to no longer need to provide that data to the airline. 830D expressly makes that provision and is respectful of the need to understand your obligations contractually in terms of respecting your customers' privacy. So where those arrangements contractually are already in place, you do not have the obligation to share that data. Where you don't, it might be a conversation that you wish to have with your customers. Ultimately, what you're looking for is to ensure that you have permission to share that. Another proposal that I would recommend is that you may want to review the commercial agreements you have with your airlines to further enforce what is already stipulated in 830D, but which we have picked up as not consistently being applied, which is the fact that there is indeed abuse of the data being provided, where we've had several examples across the globe of airlines utilizing that data to directly market to the customer. And you may want to ensure that that is incorporated in your commercial agreements, that on the basis of the requirements around 830D, they have not got the permission or the right to use that data for any other reason than to manage flight disruptions or flight changes. I can also tell you that I'm working very closely with the Madrid office of IATA to develop a set of communications that will globally be sent out to travel agents and airlines to specifically help understand how to interpret Resolution 830D in terms of your rights and obligations and responsibilities, so that everybody understands what is the intention behind it. I think a great example that was presented to me a couple of days ago was where we are hearing how airlines are notifying schedule changes directly to customers 3 months in advance of the travel date. That is not the intention of 830D. Whilst there is indeed a flight interruption or a change that is taking place, there is sufficient time for that to be communicated through the TMC or the travel agent, and the airline should not be communicating at that early stage directly with the customer. These are some of the processes and the operational issues that we are working with IATA on in terms of ensuring that we get communication out to everybody and that there isn't abuse of 830D going forward. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Otto. The last point that I want to make on this slide is just regarding the record keeping requirements in POPI. So obviously, when you have transactions happening on a daily basis, etc., there are various pieces of legislation, most of them relating to tax and accounting, that requires that you keep extensive records of your transactions for between 5 and 7 years, depending on which one you are looking at. There are other kinds of legislation that also applies to how long you keep your records relating to your employees, etc. And that POPI respects that, as does the GDPR. So you are entitled to hold on to information for as long as you need it. And that need often arises as a result of legislation. Sometimes these needs are operational. And as long as you are keeping a record of the reasons why you are retaining personal information after you stop using it, you should be fine. Now, at this point, I'm going to move on to talking about, this is still the how to comply, but we want to talk about what to do when something goes wrong. I want to pause for a moment just to say that obviously this is the first formal webinar that we have had on the topic of POPIA and the GDPR, and that as there's more clarity on when this act will become effective, there will also be other opportunities for training that will be presented via ASATA in the future. For those of you who are panicking because this overview was rather, an overview, there will be future communications and future opportunities to get training on the detail of POPI. Right, so in the spirit of hoping for the best and planning for the worst, I would say I often get asked the question, if I have limited time and a limited budget to look at POPI compliance, what is the one thing that you suggest I do? And that one thing for me is always planning for when a data breach or an incident regarding personal information happens. Because the bad news, I suppose, is that it is almost inevitable. Most companies can expect sometime in their existence that something is going to go wrong with the personal information that they process, and there are definitely better or worse ways to deal with that. So firstly, when we talk about data breaches, it falls in the confidentiality bracket of the CIA triad, or the information security triad. So we talk a lot about access should be granted on a need-to-know basis and on the basis of roles-based access. So one of the things that you need to understand is there's this perception that information security breaches, such as the ones that we talked about earlier, happen because of some guy in his mother's basement coding and hacking your systems, and that does happen, but it is not in the majority of cases when companies are fined, it's not because they got hacked. It's almost expected that you will get hacked. It is about what the hacker had access to once they were in. Also, increasingly, we find that as the South African economy goes down, people are increasingly under a lot of financial pressure. So we are seeing an uptick in the cases where employees steal records of customers or even of fellow employees and sell them. And these records actually go for a fairly handsome amount of money. So it's imperative that you assess who has access to what inside your business, so that if there is unauthorized access, or if an employee is tempted to make off with records of passengers or of their fellow employees, that they don't just have easy access to it. That is the kind of thing that you get fined for. So, for instance, the most expensive data breach, well, that has changed actually now. The most expensive data breach now is the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal that they just got fined $5 billion for. But up until that point, a couple of days ago, the most expensive breach was one of a credit bureau in America called Equifax. Someone accessed the credit records of 140 million people across the globe, mostly Americans, by exploiting a known systems, I suppose it was a known vulnerability in their service software. And the reason why it is the most expensive breach, second most expensive breach, things are fast in data privacy these days, is because once the person had access, there was basically unfettered access to all of the files that Equifax has. And so that is what they were getting fined for. So the first sort of defense that you have is to almost assume that at some point someone is going to want to get access to something that they shouldn't have access to, and to set your internal access rules so that as few as possible people, only the people who really need access to all of your personal information, have that access. Unfortunately, particularly in the small to medium size enterprises that we assess annually, we find that sort of this universal access seems to still be the norm, and that is a practice that is indefensible. And my gauge for whether something's defensible or not is pretty low. It's whether I can make an argument for it with a straight face. But from an information security point of view, having roles-based access is considered the base minimum of what you should be doing. Then I wanted to just talk about what POPI actually says about information security. So it says that you must ensure the integrity and confidentiality of information, and you must protect it against loss or damage, unauthorized destruction, or unlawful access or processing. And you must do that through what they call reasonable technical and organizational measures. At this point, we can all give lawyers a slow round of applause to say thank you for once again writing things in language that is not particularly easy to understand. Basically, what technical and organizational measures means is that you need to have the required policies, and there is no definitive list, but at a minimum you need an information security policy, and then below that you need policies regarding confidentiality, regarding integrity, regarding access or availability. You need processes through which those policies are implemented. You need to ensure, POPI actually expressly requires it, that people are trained on their roles, and that implies that they have clear roles in respect of data privacy and the handling of personal information. And then lastly, you should be checking up on them. A policy isn't considered implemented before you start measuring whether it is implemented, which implies that you should do some form of auditing. As they say, assumption, very dangerous. So I just want to dispel a couple of these. So cyber insurance, often people just take out cyber insurance because they think, okay, now I'm sorted. If something goes wrong, my cyber insurance will take care of it. And the problem with that is if you haven't done the work, so if you don't have the policies, procedures, you haven't done the training, and you haven't done audits, your cyber insurer won't buy out. They usually, in the questionnaires before you take out the cyber insurance, they will ask you about your policies, procedures, and audits. Often companies fib on those questionnaires. or they put there, yes, we have a policy, but they neglect to mention that it hasn't been properly implemented, in which case the insurer can repudiate. And they'll also look at whether you behave negligently, and typically the insurance won't pay. Even if when it does pay, it usually pays about 25% of the company's actual loss, because it doesn't cover you for the business disruption portion of that 36.9 million, as well as the costs relating to your loss of reputation or goodwill. Also, for every rand you spend on tech, you should also spend a rand on training. And why we say that is it doesn't matter whose research you read, the leading cause of data breaches is human error. And the reason for that is because people's favorite password is still 123456. The only one that's that popular is 123456 so people will get around even the best designed systems with the most secure firewalls, etc. We've already spoken about the fact that data breaches are not necessarily the only incidents that will get you into regulatory hot water. If you lost your data, if your data is of poor quality, you may also be in trouble. And then lastly, we always focus a lot on digital information because that is, the world we live in now. But the reality is that the vast majority of incidents of identity theft start with a paper record, and that's because there are people, they call themselves dumpster divers. They don't have a union yet, but they have a name for themselves. And what they do is they stand around on landfills and outside office parks, and they go through bins and they look for pieces of paper with personal information on that, with personal information on the paper. I immediately think of all the credit card statements that I've thrown away unopened, because I don't need that kind of bad news. If I have your credit card statement, I need very little else to start assuming your identity and spending your money. Right, so what to do when something bad happens? And there's something called the breach response playbook. So often we see the breach was bad, but it is exacerbated 1,000-fold by the fact that companies don't plan ahead for what they are going to do when this happens. And these days, inevitably, it happens out in the public eye. So firstly, be transparent and specific and outline the findings and fixes that you are employing. So if it gets out in the media that you've been breached, be very clear about what you are doing to fix it. Educate people on how to protect themselves. There are various products out there, and often companies that suffer data breaches make them available for their clients, where you can monitor for fraud on your accounts, and you can even stop credit from being taken out in your name temporarily or for an extended period of time to protect yourself. There is nothing wrong with apologizing. It is not necessarily admission of negligence. It is just we show that we have empathy with our customers, and usually we find that what studies have shown is that people appreciate that apology, and it tends to mitigate some of your reputational harm. If your employees are also your customers, so if your employees also make use of your services and their information has been compromised, take care of them first so that they can stop panicking and assist you in responding to the breach. And then if it affects other organizations, which in the travel industry, inevitably it may, so if there are downstream suppliers where they might now be vulnerable to attempts of fraud, you should let them know, and you should let them know what they should do now. For instance, Equifax had to notify all financial services companies in America of what had happened, because the information that got stolen is typically used as security questions when a person phones the call center at their bank, etc. So if it is that kind of information that got compromised, it might have a downstream effect. So here's what you need. And then we're going to pause for questions. Firstly, you should think now already about who is your team. Who are the people who are going to help you when something goes wrong? What happens usually is companies get fined a lot of money because they were slow in responding. And I often have a lot of sympathy with them. So for instance, in the Target breach, one of the reasons why those class action settlements reached $160 million is because they took 6 weeks to respond. The reason for that, if you take a closer look, is because they struggled to find external information security specialists to come and do the forensic audit. And once they found one that was available, obviously then there's first a vendor application and all kinds of administrative processes that need to run. So you should have your team, particularly the external members of your team, ready to go. You will need external information security specialists because your IT department or your IT service provider can't possibly mark their own homework. You'll need forensic auditors, etc. One of the hardest things is disaster communication. Communications, I'm sure Natalia will agree with me that that is a very specialist field of communication. There are people who specialize at it, and there aren't that many of them. So it is really important that when something bad happens, you don't first have to go through the exercise of finding one. Find one now and have them be on standby. It's not your marketing department. They're usually not trained in this, although obviously there might be exceptions to that particular rule. You also need to figure out where you are going to get your legal advice. Be careful not to use consultants. So for instance, I work for a consultancy, so I do not usually assess data breaches. And the reason for that is when you speak to your lawyer in these circumstances, you need to make sure that privilege attaches. You don't want your communications with your attorney necessarily to be subpoenaed if you need to go to court. So it is important to find someone who actually works at a law firm. And then lastly, train your employees on how to recognize when a data breach happens. They're often difficult to spot. Also make sure that they understand that they will not be disciplined because something bad happened, unless, of course, they were grossly negligent or breached policy in some bad way. You need to foster a culture of transparency. And how we tend to do that is to say, you will be in trouble if you saw or should have seen that there was a data breach and you don't report it. And that encourages employees to be open and transparent and not to hide incidents from you for fear of being fired. And once you've trained them, know that once isn't enough. You need refresher training for this kind of training quite often, because people don't work with these things every day. On that note, Nat, I'm going to hand over to you just to field some questions.
Sure. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. You've put the fear of God into me.
I'm sorry.
So again, for those of you who joined us a little bit later, if you want to ask a question, it's very easy. Just click on the Q&A folder at the bottom of your screen, type the question, and it will come through to me. I'd actually like to kick off with one, Elizabeth, if you don't mind, and that's because I have staff, and you know, when you've got, even if it's a small team, trying to train your employees and train them again, you know, as an employer, if they, despite the training, have not followed the right process, I mean, are you still held liable?
Yeah, so if what they were doing is in the course of scope of their employment, which 99% of the time it is, the company is still on the hook. The question is whether the company will be fined, right? And so I like to use the analogy of slip and fall cases in a supermarket, because we've all seen supermarkets with, you know, water or milk or whatever spilled in the aisle. And quite often I used to deal with these claims where people slip. They always break either an ankle. And the question is, are supermarkets always liable if they left, you know, water on a floor somewhere? And the answer is no. So what courts look at, and regulators, did you take all of the reasonable and appropriate steps to guard against the risk? That something bad then still happens is not the reason why you will get fined. If you behaved reasonably and you had the appropriate policies and there were procedures and you had the appropriate level of sort of technological protection, and you train your employees, the fact that an employee then does something silly and something bad happens, well, then you will still be protected against the fine because you behaved reasonably. I attended a cybersecurity training seminar the other day, and this is perhaps a bit of an IT joke, but he said, yes, what you must remember is there's no patch for stupid. And what he was saying in a rather unkind manner is that it's almost inevitable that people will make mistakes that can lead to these breaches. We are all sort of under attack fairly constantly. And the name of the game is just making sure that you do everything that you can within reason to equip your employees not to make these mistakes.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like it's a default position that it's going to happen to us. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, essentially.
Yeah, it is, unfortunately, and it's getting worse. Fortunately, the sort of default tech that your computer and your devices, etc., comes with is also getting better, right? So, so we're often shielded against the worst of it. The stuff that companies have to worry about particularly is the human behavior element. No amount of tech will protect you against staff that doesn't understand how to recognize a phishing attempt, or who downloads software without checking whether it's reputable, things like that. So that kind of training is incredibly important.
No patch for stupid. Okay, so let's
No
get
patch for stupid.
How do we know there's been a breach?
So that's an interesting question. So with the big breaches, there's this guy, and what I'm about to say is quite literally true. I'm not being funny. There's a guy in Australia, I always forget his name. And as far as I can tell, he makes his living entirely of scanning the internet and the dark web for these large sort of caches of personal information. And he then reports it to the company or to the regulator. And it's usually quite easy to trace information if you have the requisite skill. You can see from the metadata where it came from, and he then reports these breaches. So usually you have these guys, but the one in Australia does it most often. That then will report, I've just come across 130 million records containing social security numbers, and they'll say that on Twitter, or they'll let the FTC know, etc. So that's usually how it happens. Is someone spots the information on the dark web or on the internet, if you're incredibly unlucky, and they'll put it on Twitter that they've found this information, or they'll notify the company. So these things have a way of getting out. There are products, again, on the tech side that you can use that will monitor irregular activity. So, for instance, if all of a sudden a copy is made of your entire database and exported, alarm bells should go off, etc. So there are monitoring products that you can use, but normally someone external notices the breach first, and then it gets out in social media.
Oh dear. Okay, can you talk a little bit about the overlap between POPIA and GDPR? So if you're fully PCI compliant, what percentage compliance are you for POPIA compliance, for example, and GDPR compliance?
Okay. I think you misspoke there. I mean, do you mean to ask a question about PCI or about the GDPR, or both?
Both, because I know that
Okay.
there's this kind of perception
Yeah.
that you are POPIA compliant, then you are automatically GDPR compliant. But then also from a PCI compliance, is there an overlap for POPIA?
Okay, so in a nutshell, so so POPI, as I said, is based on one of the previous drafts of the GDPR. It's not identical. There are a number of differences, and we've published a white paper that highlights those, which was also published by ASATA. I think we should revive it. And there are two things that you have to keep in mind. So firstly, POPI is a bit stricter than the GDPR in one very crucial sense, and that is that in Europe, under the GDPR, only the privacy of individuals are protected, or is protected. Under POPI, we also protect the personal information relating to entities, so companies and your vendors and suppliers, etc. We're one of only two countries that do that. It's only us in Colombia. So if you're GDPR compliant, you should be POPI compliant in respect of the information that you have on individuals, but usually they won't have looked at the information that you have about companies. The other thing where POPI is much stricter than the GDPR, although there are two things, is that POPI requires a personal information impact assessment for any processing activity. Under the GDPR, it's only for certain high-risk activities. And then POPI is very strict about where you can get your information. So, for instance, that bit that I said about you're not allowed to just scrape the internet and then commercialize that information without complying with certain notification and consent duties. The GDPR is slightly less strict. So data enrichment companies in South Africa are a little bit more nervous than in the GDPR, although they do get into trouble there as well. The biggest difference between the two is that the GDPR is already in force, and those regulators are not afraid to fine companies. The fines that have been coming out are enormous. It's caught even us hardened sort of privacy specialists by surprise, the size of these fines. If you look at that British Airways breach, for instance, it was a very common breach. Someone created a fake website. That happens all the time. And they cooperated fully with the regulator, yet the regulator has indicated that she intends to fine them almost £200 million. So that's the biggest difference, is the GDPR currently has teeth. Poppy's teeth still coming. So for those travel agents that do focus on marketing to European individuals while they are in Europe, should be aware of that risk.
On that note, that is actually one of the questions. We have group bookings for people to attend conferences in South Africa from other countries. Do we have to be GDPR compliant? So the answer is yes then.
Yeah, so what they look at is, so obviously many companies, particularly if you're online, you will have the odd European customer, right? So it happens often in sort of the e-commerce environment that you may accept those or not. So what they look at is, are you targeting, can they see from your outward communication and from how you are set up that you are targeting Europeans? So you're doing it sort of as a strategy. Then they require that particular processing activity to be GDPR compliant. But now once the GDPR is triggered for some of your passengers, my experience has been that it's very expensive to then decide, well, I'm going to follow the rules for the Europeans, but not for the rest. So once you have to comply with the GDPR, you might as well comply in respect of all of the personal information that you have. It's very expensive to have different rules for different records, if that makes sense. So,
guys, just quickly, if I may, I just want to jump back to the previous question with regards to PCI compliance versus...
Yes, sorry, Otto, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to talk about that still. So I know PCI DSS has been a much spoken about topic, and many agents comply with that. And what PCI DSS will do is it'll ensure that to a degree your credit card related information will already be fairly secure because of the encryption requirements, etc. But PCI DSS only focuses on the credit card data. And of course, that's just one piece of personal information. It happens to be a very sensitive one. I mean, the payment card details, I would say for travel agents, probably one of the most sensitive pieces of personal information. But all of the other stuff, so contact details, ID numbers, passport numbers, the travel history of the person, where they live, the name of their emergency contacts. I'm now trying to think of all of the things that my travel agent asked me. All of that is personal information as well, and wouldn't have been protected as a result of your PCI DSS compliance. So PCI DSS is a good start for your credit card details, but it won't cover you to the extent that Poppy or the GDPR requires, because that covers all personal information, not just payment cards.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left to take some questions. We've got a couple more to get through here. So I'm going to start with, do you know if there are any similar data protection regulations in other African countries?
Yes, so there are a number. So there's an excellent, it's called the Global Privacy Handbook. I think it's by a company called DLH Piper. So if you Google DLH Piper and Global Privacy Handbook, you should get the result. And that handbook shows a map, and it tells you where there are privacy regulations and where there aren't. So it's difficult to, off the top of my head, to name them. Sort of a general rule of thumb is in the Francophone African countries, they tend to have adopted sort of European regulations. So Mauritius is an example of that. The SADC region, there are a lot of draft bills, but not that many that are already enacted. The other country to watch out for that has really strict privacy laws is Australia. So you're right to ask that question. Sometimes your company will be targeting multiple jurisdictions. And the important thing to do there is also to come up with a single set of rules. So usually what companies will do is they'll adopt the GDPR as their baseline, and then if they are very active in an Australian market, they might add some requirements, etc. But they'll have a single set of rules, because employing different rules for passengers or for employees, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, becomes very complicated and very, very expensive. So I would encourage people to come up then rather with a set of rules that they apply regardless of where the person comes from. But luckily, these regulations are very similar. there is a pattern.
Okay, so we have a question around 830D. So Otto, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself as well. With respect to 830D, are we still within the ruling if we only supply the client's details at time of doing the check-in, i.e. 24 hours prior to their travel?
Yeah, so Debbie, thanks for the question. I've just reread 830D. It doesn't specify at what point you need to provide that information in the booking. Having said that, I think that there's an expected understanding that you're doing it at the time of booking, but it doesn't specifically say when you should or shouldn't enter that data. It's certainly one way for you to manage that. And of course, depending on the size and the scale of your operations, that may not always be a logical or a logistically possible way of doing it. So the answer is simply there isn't any hard or fast rule that stipulates at what point within that booking life cycle you're expected to enter the data.
I want to add one thing. We've had two related issues of late. So 830D is the one, and then there was a decision by the European Court of Justice that related to a rule in terms of the European directives relating to cancellation of flights. And there is a rule that a carrier must notify passengers of cancelled flights at least 2 weeks before. Otherwise, they are at risk of paying a fine, and that fine is somewhere in the order, it depends, but the maximum is €500. And what the case was about is that the airline had in fact notified the travel agent, but the travel agent didn't pass the information on to the passenger. And what the European Court of Justice said is it's all good and well if a travel agent booked on behalf of a passenger and didn't provide the passenger details, but only the agent's details. But then if that travel agent doesn't pass on these service messages to the passengers, that the carrier is still responsible for the fine vis-a-vis the passenger, but that the carrier could, depending obviously on the contract and the particular country, they could pass that fine on to the travel agent. So if you do get these service messages on behalf of your passengers, your processes should just be set up so that they actually are passed on. Otherwise, you run the risk of having to fork out for this fine.
Wow. Okay, got a really nice question from Jenna. Is a single piece of data regarded as personal information, for example, a cell phone number or just a passport number, or is it regarded as personal when it is matched with a name or other piece of data?
Okay, so POPI applies to what is called, well, and I'm going to stick to individuals for the moment, but just keep in the back of your minds that it applies to companies as well. So POPI applies to any personal information of an identifiable living individual, right? Identifiable living individual. So Jenna's question is about what does it mean to be identifiable? And the Act defines it, and it says there must be no reasonably foreseeable method through which you can identify who the personal information belongs to. Now, something like an ID number or a passport number is an identifier, and it is very, very easy to re-identify the person if I have that piece of information. If I just had, any information that is where there's no sort of reverse lookup that you can use in order to re-identify the person. So, for instance, if I just had my own biographical information, right? I'm going to lie now, but I'm 35. I'm a female. I live in Cape Town. If that kind of information, there's no way for them to identify which 35-year-old female in Cape Town we're talking about, as long as there's no ID number in there, no cell phone number, email address, anything that's easy to reverse engineer back to an individual. ID numbers and passport numbers are considered some of the most sensitive personal information. So the Equifax breach, that one that cost $1 billion, largely involved social security numbers. And the reason why that is considered so sensitive is if my ID number is compromised, and 90% of South Africans have had their ID number compromised, there's nothing I can do to change it. It's not like a bank account, right? So when my card gets stolen, I go and I phone the bank and I change my credit card account number. If my ID gets stolen or my ID number gets stolen, there's only one way in South Africa to have your ID number changed, and that involves gender reassignment surgery. So that's not a feasible option every time it gets compromised. So that information you must guard with your lives. Australia, for instance, goes so far as to say they apply a PCI DSS type standard to the ID number and the passport number, which says that it should actually be encrypted.
So no more passport numbers on scraps of pieces of paper lying around travel agent desks.
Yeah, no, that is a bit dangerous. Look, I tend to not worry about the single passport number lying around. I worry about the database of passport numbers. So your risk increases exponentially as according to the number of data sets that you have. So I worry about the compromise of the Excel spreadsheet kept on the desktop with all of your passengers' passport numbers. And so that's the one that'll keep me up at night.
And what about like Airtable, which is kind of cloud-based and Excel spreadsheet-based? If you had all, like a whole batch of passport numbers on Airtable, I guess it's the same thing as Excel, probably worse because it's shared.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with that particular platform, but let's say you use cloud-based services such as Google or Amazon or Microsoft or whatever. My advice to people is actually, cloud-based is great, because if you use a reputable vendor, like Google spends trillions of dollars a year to ensure that their platforms are secure. They spend much more money than you and I could ever spend securing our own storage space on our computers, for instance. So I'm actually a big fan of the cloud storage, because in their contracts, they undertake to look after the information security. You must look after the rest of the compliance. They won't save you, if you shouldn't have had the information in the first place. But that is actually one of the safer storage mechanisms. You just need to be careful of these platforms where your information isn't kept confidential. So when it is shared between users, there aren't that many of them left that allow you to upload personal information, but they do exist. But if you're using an Amazon solution, a Microsoft-based solution, a Google-based solution, there are others. I wouldn't worry too much about it. They're way more invested in the security of the platform than you are.
Okay. I'm going to take one final question before we close the webinar. When sending room lists to hotels, for example, we are asked to provide client's ID or passport number, address, and contact number. How is the travel agent protected if the hotel uses that information? In the process of sending this information to the hotel, we have to email it. It's not safe.
Okay, so a number of things, and I'm glad that question came up, and it's also a nice one to close off on. So obviously you belong in the travel ecosystem, right? So if I book a hotel room, it's not just the travel agent, it's the hotel are all part of this sort of service that is provided to me. And both POPI and the GDPR have a concept that is called, in the case of the GDPR, a data controller. In the case of POPI, it's called the responsible party. And on that supply chain, the travel agent is a responsible party for their operations, and the hotel is a responsible party for their operations. And in this equation, you can't do much if a hotel or an airline requires you to send information in order to make the booking, or in order for the customer or the passenger to make use of that booking. There's not much you can do. I mean, you can object, but they're going to do what they're going to do. It's within their control. And if that practice that they are forcing on you is non-compliant, that will be their problem and their fine. You have to care about what you have control over. So, for instance, BA just had this massive breach. There's no travel agent that's going to get hammered for that particular breach just because they booked on BA. That was entirely within BA's control, and it's therefore their problem. So similarly, if airlines force requirements on you that breach the GDPR or breach POPI, that, in my opinion, is very much their problem, because they're in the driver's seat there.
What storage platform would you recommend? So what could travel agents use?
No, so I'm agnostic. I just say to people, look at their market capitalizations, how big they are. I tend to go for the big three, just because I know how much they invest in information security. If you imagine for a moment, if Google's or Amazon Prime storage facilities got massively breached, I mean that's the ball game for them. So they spend a lot of money. So I go for the recognized names, but there's not much difference between them. I don't have a preference. I just go for the recognizable brands.
You're not a very good marketer. Come on.
Well, right. Sorry, I just wanted to just jump in and add one more comment with regards to the rooming list processes.
Yes.
So from an operational point of view, I think the other thing that you need to think about is, yes, there is an obligation and responsibility that Elizabeth has identified, but what can you do to help ensure that you are protecting that information? And you mentioned that you would be, for example, emailing it. But emailing data has potential risks. So what are you doing to protect the transmission of your emails? And what are you doing to protect the data that is included in that email? So one opportunity or one possibility would be to get a piece of software that allows you to zip those files. You could possibly add a password to it so that the recipient would need to utilize that password in order to unzip the file. What you have done is you've taken every possible step to ensure that you have protected that information, both in terms of how you collected it, how you stored it, but in this particular case, also very importantly, how you have transmitted it. So I think that's just something to add from an operational point of view. Please ensure that you think about how you're protecting that information, not only how you collect it, how you store it, but it's very important that you also think about how you're transmitting it.
So a reasonable fix would be to password protect the file, encrypt the file, never put the information in the body of an email. Those kinds of tips. You will also find online top 10 ways to secure the email transmissions. You're not going to get away from it. Even sometimes my experience has been password protection poses problems because now you have to find a second way of communicating with the person to whom you are sending the file. So I, in the past, have made the error of thinking that I don't need to say this, but you can't put the password in the email to which the file is attached. You need to find a different channel. Otherwise, that's the reason why Marriott is getting such a big fine, is because they kept the decryption key in the same place as the database, which is the digital equivalent of keeping your front door key under the front door mat. So again, it's about what is appropriate, it's about what is practically possible, and about what is reasonable. So as long as you do whatever you can, if the hotel is being foolhardy and requiring this kind of information to be sent via email instead of a secure transfer protocol, which is what Otto was referring to, or building an API, there's a point at which you can't do anything, but make sure that you do what you can.
And I think this is just to add to that. I think it's very important that we understand our obligations as travel agents in this regard. So you will still have these weird occasions where you're going to have airlines asking you to fill out credit card forms, airlines asking you to photocopy the front and the back of credit cards. People do not comply to those requests because it is not appropriate. It is not PCI compliant, and airlines should be behaving better in that regard. And the same applies to all other suppliers in the value chain. Do not necessarily feel that you are obligated to respond to their requests if you believe that by responding to that request, you are placing yourself or your customer information at risk.
Thanks, guys. On that note, I'm going to close our webinar. We've gone over our 1 hour limit. Just as a reminder to everyone, we do have 2 more ASATA Live webinars coming up. One on August the 6th at 9 o'clock on protection against supplier failure. And a third one on August the 22nd at 10 o'clock in the morning. So not 9 o'clock, but 10 o'clock in the morning on guarding against internal and external fraud. If you would like to register for these webinars, you can go to asata.co.za. You'll see that there's a slider banner at the top. One of those slider banners is to access the registration for these respective webinars. So just find me August the 6th at 9 o'clock, Protection Against Supplier Failure, and August the 22nd, Guarding Against Internal and External Fraud. I'd like to thank both Otto and Elizabeth for giving us their time this morning, and we will distribute the presentation and the audio to the presentation to individuals who logged on for the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to wish you all a really, really great day, and thank you so much for joining us.